All right, so we're going to talk about one of the hot spots for jazz performance in the Village, Greenwich Village, if you want to be polite. We just say the Village. Everyone knows what that is. Right there on 15 Barrow Street is where it was. Barrow Street, yes. There was this place opened by Jimmy Garofalo. He had owned this building, this room, since 1949. And it had been a restaurant, and then it was a bar, and it was kind of like an open mic stage, and it just was not successful at all. In 1955, Charlie Parker lived across the street from the club. And, Parker had his issues. He's always trying to get over on somebody. So he went over and he offered to play a gig at the club just so he could get free drinks. Yeah, this is 55. And the owner goes, you know what, I've tried everything else, nothing works. This cat, he looked kind of sad, but he is Charlie Parker, and maybe if I advertise this, I'll get some people in this club. So all of a sudden, this Cafe Bohemia became a jazz club. And the opening act was to be Charlie Parker. Unfortunately, Charlie Parker died in 1955 before he could ever play the gig. But the idea had been planted in Mr. Garofalo's head, and he thought it was a good idea, so he proceeded to make it a jazz club. The house band was a band led by bass player Oscar Pettiford, one of the most awesome bass players in the annals of jazz. We don't hear a lot about Oscar except among bass players. Bass players have a high amount of respect for him. He was a cellist and a bass player. But Oscar, like a lot of jazz musicians about this time, he went to Europe and never came back. And so, although we did not talk about him a whole lot in this country, on the world stage, Oscar Pettiford was like the bass player of all bass players. At this point, however, he is the house band at Cafe Bohemia. And his sax player is Jerome Richardson. And the funny thing is, Jerome Richardson had been my Uncle Andrew's roommate in 143rd in New York City. So I have a lot of personal connection to this story. At any rate, Jerome Richardson's stock was going up, and he missed the gig because he was held late at a recording session. And Pettiford is kind of, desperate for a sax player. Charlie Rouse is sitting out there, and he asked Charlie if he'd come up and play the gig because Jerome couldn't make it. But Charlie didn't have his horn with him. And look around the room, and there's this chubby guy sitting there with a saxophone. And so Pettiford goes, hey man, why don't you go borrow that guy's horn and play the gig? Well, the problem was, number one, the guy did not want anybody playing his horn. And the second thing was Rouse played tenor, and this was alto sax. So reluctantly, Pettiford invited this young alto saxophone up on the stage. And when he did, it changed the course of jazz, and it changed the fortune of this young music teacher from Florida who was only in New York with his brother Nat to start studies at New York University. That young saxophone player was Cannonball Adderley. Yeah, that's right, Cannonball. He just happened to be in the club that night, and he sat in with Oscar Pettiford, and let's just say Oscar was all smiles. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Believe it or not, within 1 week, Cannonball is recording with the great Kenny Clark, one of the pioneers of bebop. And less than 2 months later, Cannonball is recording an album under his own name. In other words, he took New York by storm. And he still went back to Florida to teach at Dillard High School because he wasn't comfortable he could make a living doing it. But he did return, and 2 years later, in 1957, he became a member of the Miles Davis group. Now, what is unique about Cafe Bohemia is that Garofalo hired the best of the bop and hard bop guys. Kenny Dorham, Art Blakey, Miles Davis, and many of these artists chose to record at the Cafe Bohemia because the audience was always lively and appreciative, and the acoustics in the room were good. Miles Davis recorded 4 albums in a row for Prestige at Cafe Bohemia. Art Blakey recorded a live album at Cafe Bohemia. So did Kenny Dorham. So did Mingus. And in 2013, an unreleased album with Miles Davis and John Coltrane was released, and it had been recorded somewhere in the 50s at Cafe Bohemia. When Miles did his Round Midnight album, the cover art is a photo of Cafe Bohemia. So if you want to know what this room looked like in its heyday, go look at the album cover. That is Cafe Bohemia. There's a little red tinge to the album cover, and that's because there was a fluorescent light over the stage that happened to be red, and it casted kind of a red ambiance over the entire stage. I guess that's to suggest that this jazz is hot. Now, this club ran from 1955 to 1960, and then it closed down for reasons that we really do not know. But for those 5 years, it was one of the hottest jazz spots in New York City, right there in Greenwich Village at 15 Borough Street. And it all happened because a very sick and desperate Charlie Parker wanted free drinks. And before he could ever realize his dream of free drinks, he unfortunately died. But the idea he planted in the owner's head led to 5 years of the hottest jazz performances and some of the most memorable recordings of all time. And it introduced the world to a young Floridian from Tampa Bay by way of Florida A&M University, my alma mater, the great Julian Cannonball Adderley. Thank you, Cafe Bohemia, because although it only lasted for 5 years, it created more hot, hard bop jazz than clubs that lasted 4 and 5 times as long. And thank you, Mr. Garofalo, for listening to Bird as he made a suggestion. Maybe you should make this a jazz club. You can't do anything else successfully. Maybe you should let me play here and just give me some free drinks. And that's the rest of the story. Thank you, Cafe Bohemia.